September 28, 1979, made Brussels and Carmel. We'll do an update on the notorious Michael Sindona. He's been missing since August the 2nd. He was supposed to appear in court in New York City. He took part in the collapse of the Franklin National Bank in 1974. It was described as the country's biggest bank failure. He was walking down Fifth Avenue and just disappeared. A group sent a letter saying that they had him. They're called the Proletariat of the People. I thought it was an excuse for him to escape trial here in New York City. But they have pictures of him they keep sending, and they have written to Italy for the names of the Liechtenstein and Swiss bank accounts, the numbers of Mr. Sindona's banks, and they want information. They've sent a list of 10 questions to Italy that they want answered by his cohorts there. The people that have him, if you can believe these letters, claim that a trial in the United States and a trial in Italy would never bring out the truth about Mr. Sindona. I almost believe it's a real group when I see that, because that is the truth. If we had John Mitchell kidnapped, or various Watergate defendants like Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, and kept and tortured, we may have gotten a little bit of the story out. So the Proletariat of the People, if they are real, are sending letters and pictures of him. In 1969, the exact year that the Polish Pauline brothers were beginning their escapade that has lost about $20 million, was the same year that Sindona went to Milan to see the Cardinal. He was Cardinal then, and became Pope Paul VI. And he was a Sicilian banker. He worked with organized crime and the Mafia. He became a consultant for Vatican finances. And then over 5 years, he took the Vatican money out of their real estate holdings. They had been given large amounts of land by the Germans and the Italians in order to have a non-interference when the revolution, civil war came in Spain with Franco. And after World War II, with the rearming of Germany, in exchange for the Vatican being quiet, they were given large land holdings. And then in 1969, the cash for the land holding was converted, and I've done a lot of that on tape 364. You can go back and get some background on Pope Paul VI and Sindona. It's important to link of Sindona to the present John Paul I, who's coming, because this pope is a protege of Pope Paul VI, so that they're all in this thing together for sure. He took from the Vatican, at one time they said 46 million. That was several years ago, but it's gone into many, many more millions that he's lost for the Vatican. As I say, it was estimated that the combined losses that he had in Italy and in 10 other countries comes to about $500 million. Now that is a lot of money. When you're talking about funding fascist, rightist, Nazi movements, you wonder where some of these losses went. He conspired to conceal the fact that $40 million that he used to control the Franklin National Bank in 1972, when he came over here from Italy, with investments from the Vatican, was fraudulently and illegally removed from his other banks in Italy. So he's wanted in 2 countries, one for taking the money here and the other for the disappearance of the money and letting the bank collapse. Sindona has a history of going back to the Sicilian Milan Mafia connections, and now they're trying to extradite him. Italy wanted him just before his disappearance. He was sentenced to 30 months in jail there and wanted for a $250 million fraud of his Italian banking operations. No wonder this guy is missing. There's a 99-count U.S. indictment that was issued on him in March of 1979. He was out on his own recognizance, and as I say, August the 2nd, 3 weeks before the trial in the United States, he was gone. Pope Paul VI and Sindona are making arrangements between the Vatican money and the international financiers around the world. And Sindona came along and said that he would unload Vatican holdings and diversify them on the American market, and began to buy stocks into Exxon and American corporations. Since this investigation is going, and while he was working with his lawyers, There was death at the Vatican or around it. An Italian lawyer, George Ambrosoli, was shot to death July 12, 1978. Three unidentified men came to his area home and shot him. He had just provided documents at the request of Sindona's lawyer and given them up for the fraud trial in New York City. There was another death in addition to that one, another person that worked with George Ambrosoli, and he died. His name was Boris Giuliani. He was deputy superintendent of police in Palermo, Sicily. The Sedona inquiry, according to the New York Times, is getting help from the Italian Parliament because there's Vatican links to organized crime. The Sicilian Milan Mafia has been written up. The first book that I read about the links of that were in Bruce Roberts' unpublished letters called The Gemstone File, where he links Pope Paul, who was the Montini Secretary of the Vatican at the time, to the Golden Triangle and dope dealing in Southeast Asia and Asian and South American narcotics traffic. Bruce Roberts was the first person to make those connections, and then a book came out on the OSS and said that Pope Paul VI, as a priest and cardinal, had been in the OSS, which then became the CIA. And of course the CIA escalated their drug importation connections after the war in Southeast Asia. That's why there's so many drugs everywhere in the United States now. That was one of the purposes of the war in Southeast Asia. The New York Times said Sindona was described by the Italian press as linked to several murders. They talked about the lawyer, Giorgio Ambrosoli, and also Boris Giuliano, the superintendent of police in Palermo, Sicily. Can you imagine the fun of having that job? Ambrosio was investigating, this is according to the New York Times, Sindona's bankruptcy case. He reached a breakthrough when he was shot. Giuliano was investigating a large-scale smuggling of drugs from Sicily to the United States that's known to be mob control. He was shot in the back on the way to the police headquarters in July 21st, 1979. The other gentleman was shot July 12th. They had recently found that there were large amounts of money gained in drug smuggling that were laundered and disguised in so-called legal transactions by Michael Sindona. Can you imagine taking Vatican church money and laundering it and multiplying those funds, how you could take a measly 46 or 50 million from the Vatican and turn it into multi-billion-dollar operation? Well, the Sindona-owned banks in Italy and Switzerland have been recognized, or these two investigators were coming upon the fact that they were used for laundering money and disguising it into legal transactions. And these two men that died just a week apart from each other had met together in Milan just before Ambrosoli was killed. And this is linked. They were doing work on the Sedona banks in Milan and Liechtenstein, and the banking connections that he had from Sicily and the Vatican to drug smuggling and organized crime and money washing and so forth. And right after Mr. Sindona got some information from this particular lawyer, probably finding out how much he knew, he was shot, the lawyer was shot, and the police chief was shot. And then the stockholders of the bankrupt Banca Privata over in Italy urged the United States former ambassador, his name is Graham Martin, to investigate and clarify the secret American funding of the Italian political parties through the Sedona banks, that the elections are being altered by money from the Sedona banks, and that illegally he had removed so many millions from these banks and was handing payments. Sedona was handling these payments of secret U.S. funds to both the Socialist and Social Democratic parties as well as the Christian Democrats. He handed over between $600 million between 1972 and 73. He handled that amount of money between these years. Giuseppe Melzi, a lawyer representing the stockholders of this bankrupt bank, said that the Sindona case, in quotes, is a collective phenomena, not the case of a high-risk financier. It is a case of economic criminality in very specific circles. And he said that Sindona handled the payment of secret U.S. funds to these political parties. He was managing assets of over $600 million, 600 million American dollars, between 1972 and 73. It involved British banks and speculation and the currencies that could run to $5 billion. And they're asking, the investigators in the United States to focus in Zurich, Switzerland, and go to top banking officials and find out what is going on and the effect on the political parties in Italy and the loss of money in these banks. Looking in the Amnicor Bank of Zurich, Switzerland, where they say there's illegal operations by top Italian figures, and they believe some of the money is stored there. They thought that Mr. Ambrosoli, the attorney, was liquidating the bankrupt Sindona Bank, and the reason he was murdered that he, in quotes, according to the New York Times, might have uncovered financial scandals that involved Sindona, his associates that included Italian politicians. Now, this is important because the Pope is coming here to this country to give the aura of all is well, I'll bring you peace and love, and yet all this killing and swindling and these millions of dollars, possibly going to billions, are going to political parties, are going to unknown sources, and goodness knows what it will be invested in that can bring murder and death and future conspiracies down on us. These floating millions of billions of dollars are very, very dangerous. There are connections from 1969. Richard Nixon became president in 1968. And the Pauline Fathers and Sindona and Pope Paul VI shenanigans began in 69 with their involvement of American money. And remember, we had this huge, vast CIA plan to combine our military, our intelligence agencies, the FBI, the police state, all into one, getting ready for that real fascism such as they had in Germany and Italy. And I mentioned on tape 364 Michelle Sindana's offer to give $1 million to the re-election of Richard Nixon at the time of Watergate for the 1972 election. Incidentally, the Vatican, in case some of you don't have that tape or know it, totally owns the Watergate Hotel, where John Mitchell and Rosemary Woods and Claire Luce Booth and many of the Maurice Stans, who was offered the $1 million from the Vatican, all live at the Watergate Hotel. Claire Booth used to be ambassador to the Vatican for the United States. And just not to digress too far, but to fit in an example of how these chronologies of people intertwine through this Cold War, hot war period, there's an article in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago about Henry Cabot Lodge, and it gives some interesting years that tie in with the Sindona, Nixon assassination teams, the Vatican, the Milan Mafia, and the Watergate teams. Henry Cabot Lodge was a senator from Massachusetts in 1938 and lost his seat to John Kennedy in 1952 as a senator. He ran against Kennedy again as vice president along with Richard Nixon, the man who was going to be offered these huge amounts of Vatican money and part of the CIA operation. Nixon's vice president in 1960 to defeat John Kennedy for president was Henry Cabot Lodge, so Lodge lost twice to John Kennedy. Eisenhower had appointed him after he lost the Senate seat to Kennedy to be ambassador to the United Nations. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson then asked him to be the ambassador to Vietnam, where he betrayed DM and got out of town fast the night that DM was murdered, talked to him on the telephone and played dumb about that particular murder. But after Nixon became president in 1968, at the time that Vatican shenanigans of 69 were beginning to start between Sindona and Pope Paul VI, the Pauline Fathers, and the Polish links inside to the Cardinal Carroll inside of Poland, they're missing $20 million. 1969 was a key year. That's the year that Richard Nixon appointed Ambassador Lodge to the Vatican. So we had Claire Luce, who lived at the Watergate Hotel once, an ambassador to the Vatican, and Henry Cabot Lodge, an ambassador to the Vatican. The connections of the Vatican to the Republican Party and the CIA, and then the CIA and Republicans pouring it back into the Italian elections, is an incestuous deal. But when you tie it in with Nazis and CIA and missing 46 million, 500 million, 20 million, then you have to begin to say, hey, we may have had our Watergate, we may have stopped those secret funds from going through one source, but where else is it being passed? And how in the world can you break through church fascism or get into the books of churches? It's totally impossible. The Sedona Empire included major banks, industrial companies, luxury hotels, a company in Liechtenstein, and one of the directors of the banking company in Liechtenstein that was being investigated by the lawyer that was murdered this last July was David Kennedy, who Richard Nixon had appointed former he was Secretary of the Treasury under the Nixon administration, with strong links to Michael Sindona, to Pope Paul VI, the Milan Mafia, who are now being investigated as being involved in dope smuggling and money washing and surreptitious handling of funds into narcotics traffic, and then death of primary witnesses. The kidnappers of Sindona are now asking, as I said, 10 questions. They want to know the bank account numbers, the alleged illegal financial dealings involving Sindona and his banks, and they're asking questions that would, this is according to Nicolas Cage in the New York Times, would embarrass major political parties, figures all over the world, in that country and elsewhere, important businessmen, financial institutions, and the Vatican. It's interesting that Nicolas Cage is writing these articles for the New York Times on the missing Sindona. He wasn't at first, but as the case escalates and they're asking these embarrassing questions, he comes in because he's the expert on organized crime, the Mafia, and has written books on the smuggling narcotics traffic. So it's interesting that that writer is getting in on the Vatican kidnapping. The New York Times, as usual, has to cover all their bases. It wasn't hard to smell something rotten the minute that gentle little Pope lived 30 days and then died, and there were articles in Italy about his being poisoned. But as soon as the information came out that this Pope from Poland had such strong connections with Pope Paul VI at the time that he was a priest in Rome, being his protege, he worked under Montini, who at that time was writing those passports for the Nazis. You might have known that these old dogs didn't have very many new tricks. So if you just stay with them and watch them, they swindle in and out of these banks with their drug dealing, murders, and nothing else is new as far as the history of the church goes. It's just that little pieces come out now, thank goodness, because since Watergate, there is a little more awareness of writing some of these articles. If they're not making all the connections, they're at least making some of them. Now, there was another article on the Vatican. This was in June of this year, 1979. This is from the New York Times. It has to do with a law firm and a man named David Walters. Now, we've left the Nixon administration, and we're now with Jimmy Carter, also with his drug connections in the South and all over the country. That isn't anything new either. But David Walters was Jimmy Carter's personal representative to the Vatican. Now, his law office, this is a favor to Mr. Walters and Jimmy Carter, the law office is being sued, not David Walters or his partner, but the law office has been indicted by a federal grand jury in an alleged conspiracy to illegally provide the United States visas for other foreign clients. The office wrote visas for 34 alien clients. Now, nothing is new there either. As I say, Montini was writing aliases and passports for Martin Bormann and those likes. As soon as the war scaled down in Germany, they were allowed to go to South America, to Uruguay, Paraguay, down to Shanghai, Argentina, Brazil, Chile. Well, the law office of Mr. Walters is being sued, if you can sue a law office. He has a partner, but the partner isn't being named in the lawsuit. There's two men in the partner. The other one is Sarino Costanzo. Watch that name, put it on an index card. It'll be important someday. The law firm is being indicted. The agent involved is a Stephen Vitale, V-I-T-A-L-E, former State Department employee. He was charged with conspiracy in this scheme. Vitale worked at the United States Embassy in Nassau and helped the law firm of David Walters, Carter's personal representative to the Vatican, provided visas for 34 alien clients that were done through the State Department agent, Mr. Vitale, in the Bahamas, in Nassau, the Bahamas, and then after he did that, Mr. Vitale joined the law firm last year of Mr. Walters and Mr. Costanzo. David Walters resigned from his Vatican post last year when the investigation of the Miami firm became known. These 34 aliens were clients of the law firm. They were described as Europeans, Latins, and Asians. They were given American visas, 34 of them, through the U.S. Embassy in a time period of November 76 to 77. The head of the consular office there left that office then, went to the law firm whose clients he had served, and Mr. Walters resigned from his job at the Vatican when this federal grand jury indictment came up of alleged conspiracy to provide United States visas for foreign clients. We might transcribe that foreign agents. Jack Anderson has an article about those assassination teams down in Chile and how they send bombs in this country and use the Chilean airline, and a confession by Michael Vernon Townley, who was involved in the Letelier murder in Washington, D.C., that he was offered by the airlines and the officials when he took part in the murder of Letelier that he would be given a false name and car rental and airplane tickets and so forth. How much money of this Vatican money that was set up by Sindona and Pope Paul VI goes down to Chile, Paraguay, from West Germany and Mexico and around the world? How much of those missing millions of dollars are going to those assassination teams that are continuing the terrorism and murdering any critics of a regime such as the Nazi regime in Chile that Pinochet took over? When President Augusto Pinochet came in, the swastikas were out, the Nazis were in power. It takes a lot of money to whip up that fervor and keep this German feeling going, and these visas that come out of a Miami office are important to know who they are and who those 34 people are. What kind of spies are we sending around the world? Why is the president's appointed ambassador to the Vatican using his office or use their office to get visas for aliens that shouldn't be in this country through the State Department agent that they buy off by hiring him into their office to work for him after he leaves the State Department? There's one other question in my mind that I'm going to throw out, but you might investigate it for me, you people that live in New York. The lawyer representing the Vatican and this terribly dynamic case that involves the CIA, the Watergate team, the Vatican, Italian politicians, the man representing this case is a Marvin E. Frankel, the attorney for Mr. Sindona, who has now disappeared. Mr. Frankel was a former federal judge, and he is handling the Sindona case. He was to handle it if it went to court, and he is he's on record as their attorney. Now, a Dr. Charles Frankel and his wife were murdered in New York. He was a professor at Columbia University. There was a burial at St. Paul's Chapel in New York City. He was a very popular man. May of this last year, he was murdered along with his wife. Dr. Charles Frankel had one brother named Aaron Frankel, but I just wonder if there was by any slim chance a relationship to Marvin E. Frankel, because one murder took place, the double murder in New York City, May of this year, 1979, and it was in August that the other Mr. Frankel's client disappeared, and both men had high jobs. One, as I say, a federal judge, and the other had worked in the State Department. It was a very important with government connections. As a matter of fact, the one that was murdered in New York was so important that Justice Byron White of the United States Supreme Court read part of the services for the family at the funeral. So much for the Pope and his visit, if I can stomach it. The publicity and the photographs that are taking place, I hope I can stand the next couple of weeks and the miles of newspaper praising this angelic man, and I'm sure he's coming to patch up some of the wounds or appreciate maybe the money that went into making him Pope. He's coming around to pat the cardinals on the head. Some of this missing money, I'm sure, went into the politics of Poland, and a lot of it is probably sitting...
Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we.